I am calling the Wednesday, September 13th, 2023 Economic Development Commission meeting to order at 6:30 p.m. Tonight's Economic Development Commission meeting will be held hybrid for the public using Zoom. Commission members and staff will be participating in this meeting in person. As chair, I'll be leading the Economic Development Commission meeting, and the public is welcome to participate when invited throughout the meeting. Members of the public may attend the meeting by joining via online Zoom at https://zoom.us/join and typing in meeting ID 837-7587-8689. Once you're logged into the meeting, please use the chat feature to tell the moderator which item you wish to speak to. You may also call into the meeting at 651-372-8299 and enter meeting ID 837-7587-8689. Now, onto the agenda. The next item on the agenda tonight is adoption of the agenda. Do any members of the commission have any changes to the agenda? Staff, do you have any changes?
No changes from staff.
May I please have a motion for adoption of the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
All right. Can I get a vote to adopt the agenda, please? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay. All opposed? Abstain? Great. Then the motion is carried. The next item on the agenda is considering approval of the July 12th, 2023 Economic Development Commission meeting minutes. Economic Development Commission members, are there any changes to the minutes? Staff, are there any changes?
I have a quick mention.
Oh, you have, yeah.
So I was looking at my comment at the bottom when we did the changing of the chairs. And when I read it, I was like, ooh, that was a bit harsh. Did I say that like that? So I went back, I looked at the video. And I just want to update my comment to mirror what I said at the meeting, which was it's time for new membership to guide the Economic Development Commission instead of Crystal no longer wants to be chair. If we can just do that. And then I noted, Brahms, your name is spelled Brooms in one space. So.
Thank you for noticing that.
Yes.
All right.
That is noted.
Great. Staff, do you have any changes to the agenda?
No changes from staff.
All right. Can
I move for the approval as amended just now.
Thank you.
I will second that.
Great. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstain? Okay, motion carried. The next item on the agenda is considering approval of, nope, we already did that. Where are we now? Oh, so we're moving on to Economic Development 101
Yes.
training? Great. And then that will be presented by Jason Arsvold.
Good evening, Madam Chair, Commissioners. I'm Jason Arsvold with Ellers. Glad to be with you tonight for the topic of just a brief economic development overview. And for some of you, I know this is probably review. You've heard me say this before, but just a couple of things that I wanted to cover today. And again, feel free to stop me whenever we're going here, and we can have a, if you need questions or want me to explain something further, happy to do it. Just trying to be casual, but we'll start by just talking a little bit about what is economic development, how you prepare for success in economic development. We're going to talk a little bit about policies and plans and providing local assistance for projects and how to protect local resources in that endeavor. Some of the tools that you have available to yourselves to be able to do some of that work, and then end with a relevant local project example where all of these things kind of came together in a textbook example of how to really apply some of this kind of things that we're going to talk about. And it's one that we actually use when we talk to other communities about how, it's in Burnsville, but we talk about this about other communities as a kind of point to it as a best practice. So just briefly here, what is economic development? I know a lot of us kind of think about, well, this is out there doing deals with businesses and things like that. And that's part of it, but I think most importantly what it is, and I think you all are intimately knowledgeable with this, is that it's really, adopting policies and plans that guide your activities. That's a lot of what happens at your level. It's then creating, funding and staffing and programs that help support those goals and policies that you've been developing. Those can, have a wide range of applicability. It's raising funds for those initiatives, right, at the local level here, through the city, but also grants and other sources of funding that are out there. And then, yes, it is entered into those public-private partnerships to help get things done in your community and doing those deals to accomplish your goals and objectives. Why do we do it? There's a few reasons why. Many of them are listed here. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the most typical reasons why cities engage in economic development. So, the two big ones are job creation and tax-based growth and diversification. That's frankly, probably 75% of economic development effort is geared towards those two things. Redevelopment is part of that, but it's more kind of specific. Neighborhood preservation, development of infrastructure, improving affordable housing availability and choice, land cleanup, pollution cleanup, kind of tied to redevelopment. And we've got some of that in the case study that we're going to talk about. And even enhancing the quality of life. So if you think about things like, trails and amenities and things of that nature, those are all really also tied to economic development. So, that's why it's done. How do you participate in that? So, as really the policymakers for economic development in the city, you participate like other communities along a spectrum. There are many communities that just don't do anything at all for economic development. They may, like the idea of something occurring, but they really don't want to commit city time or resources to making that happen, and they'll play a more limited role. And you can participate all the way up onto the other end of the spectrum in an extremely aggressive role. You have communities that will actually spend public resources to go out and acquire property, demolish buildings, build infrastructure to promote growth in, new development within the community, and everywhere in between. So there's no one right or wrong way to be on that. It's just kind of how communities tend to operate. For you all, what is your role in that? And again, I'm going to talk about like policymaker role and staff roles, and there's no really, again, right or wrong way. This is just how we see it work most effectively, is if you all are playing that big picture role where you're setting priorities for the staff, you're deciding what you want to see happen in the community, what you want staff to spend their time doing, and so that they know what they need to do with respect to their jobs. You're developing those policies that I will talk a little more about. You're an ambassador out there in the community to champion these projects, and eventually you all in the city council will approve assistance for projects, but not necessarily sitting at the table with a business or a developer to negotiate all the details about that. And so then that's where the staff role comes in. The staff role is really to take the direction that you all have given through your policies, plans, and things of that nature, and implement that. You've given them the direction about what they should be going and doing. They're going to go out there and try to do that. So that's what their job is, put those programs in place that answer those questions and meet those goals. They're at the front line. They're the ones that are actually, approving the level of assistance for these projects. If a request for financial assistance comes in, it gets reviewed through the lens of the policies that you all have adopted and then brought back to you with a recommendation. And that's their job to suss all of that out, provide the details that you need to make a good decision and bring that forward. And then, of course, always keeping connected with the business community and residents on issues of economic development is also an important staff role. Questions about that? It's pretty basic, kind of straightforward. And we always, before you even, spend a single dollar doing any kind of economic development, we always think it's very important to think about what you want to do to prepare to be successful. We've been in a lot of places where, you might think you just made the greatest deal in the world to do something in the community, but if that thing that you didn't push you towards your goal, it's really kind of a waste of time and public effort. So in our view, anyways, it's pretty important that you do some things to prepare for success. The biggest one that we generally recommend is establishing an economic development kind of a redevelopment plan. What that does is it helps make sure that the policymakers and the staff are all on the same page, sets a foundation for the things that you want to do, and then when opportunity does arrive, you're there and prepared for it. And I think one of the biggest things that it does is actually it sets priorities for limited resources, right? So we know we don't have unlimited staff time and unlimited dollars to do projects with out there. And so we need to make sure that when those are used and you are directing those towards a public economic development effort, that you're doing it for something that you want. otherwise, as I said, you're kind of spinning your wheels and wasting your time. Now, the thing that I can say about Burnsville is that you've done a lot of this work. Some of you were involved with that work several years ago to put a strong plan in place. So you have that plan already available to you. I know you're probably familiar with it. I won't go through all of this, but this just lists off some of the goals in your current plan that came out of that process, right? So you went through a big process to sit down and think about, what do we want to do as a community? What's important to us? What do we want to have in our plan? What do we want to spend the next several years working on to make sure that we're accomplishing the things that we want to accomplish in Burnsville? And so these are the goals that came out of that. And then what falls out from that is adoption of policies to set parameters for public assistance. And, you know, there are requirements in statute related to this. Anytime a city wants to provide financial assistance, that can be, you know, a loan, even a fee forgiveness, tax increment financing, tax abatement, anything that exceeds basically $25,000 in value, there's a statute that governs some notifications and some reporting requirements around that. And you have to have a policy established by statute in order to do that. So you've always had that kind of base policy, but did spend some time again several years ago to really think through with the city council what you wanted that policy to look like. So you have not only a statute or a policy that meets the minimum statutory requirements, you have one that's very robust and defines all the things that you as a community want to see. And you know, so that again is just, this is just you can't read that and it's not intentional, but that's just the front page of what you've called your development tools policy. And so it's comprehensive in nature and it covers any assistance that you might provide to you know, any business, any developer, any project. Again, it's required by statute, as I said, but yours goes further and does more to indicate the kind of things that you want to see happen within Burnsville. And so, you know, that's been really helpful, particularly in the case study that I'll talk about, for the staff to be able to understand when someone comes to them, is it something that is a project that you actually want to assist? And as a former staff person myself, having that understanding is a really key piece of success in this whole process. And and because that's there, and because of the project case study that we're going to talk about, it's why we cite it as like a textbook example of how this should work. What it also does finally is it communicates to the development community the kind of things that you will and won't assist. So, you know, if a developer comes to you asking for something that just isn't fitting within that policy, it's very easy for your staff to say, you know, look, this isn't something that, you know, we want to pursue as a community, and that helps save their time, right? Not pursuing your time, not pursuing a project that ultimately isn't going to be approved. So having those things in place are extremely important to actually dealing with these requests when they come before you and understanding how they fit within the goals of the community. So if a project does come to you after having gone through this planning process and meets your policies and is asking you for financial assistance, which is ultimately sometimes what this comes down to, the question is, why would you provide it? Why is it necessary? And this is a question we get all the time from appointed and elected officials and staff, frankly, that, you know, they're asking us for all this money. Why do they need it? And if someone is there asking you for money, typically, you know, there is a reason why. Sometimes there's not, but typically there is. But some of the list here are some of the reasons why we see that happening. I mean, fundamentally, what it is that you might have a piece of property that has some barrier that's preventing it from being developed in the way that you want to see it happen as a city. And those barriers, they're typically financial barriers. The private marketplace isn't developing those sites because developers have taken a look at those sites, you know, ran the numbers and determined that they couldn't make a profit if they were to undertake the project, and so therefore it sits there. Again, the case study that we have is a textbook example of this, but some of the big reasons are, you know, contaminated land, you know, or existence of blighted buildings. Those tend to get passed over for greenfield development opportunities where those costs don't exist. There may be high development fees. There may be simple market dynamics, which we've experienced here in the metropolitan area where, and in greater Minnesota, frankly, where the market rents for rental housing, for example, are simply too low to support the costs of what it is to build new apartment projects. Now, that was a dynamic that's, you know, probably 6 or 8 years old now. We're back to that again, but those are some reasons why some of those multifamily housing projects needed assistance simply because, you know, the rents were too low, or because affordable rents were required. Some cities have policies that require affordable rents. That needs assistance to help make that work. Cost of infrastructure can be too high. You know, it might be a piece of property that doesn't have utilities extended to it. You know, it's not going to develop if it can't afford to bring those utilities out there. We see in a lot of, you know, site search processes where, you know, a business may be comparing community A against community B, and they have found that there are cheaper alternatives in community B than in community A, and so you're trying to overcome some of that. And that happens often, not just, you know, neighboring cities within our metropolitan area, but oftentimes we're competing across the globe for some of this business investment in our communities, and so we're helping to try and offset that. And then sometimes, you know, city vision is just incompatible with what the market is willing to deliver. You might have a site where you say, I want to see a destination retail development happen on there, and the market's saying, well, we can build an indoor enclosed storage building and that's it. You know, so that might be an opportunity for the city to say, look, is there a way that through our tools that we have available, could we make what we want to see feasible? And so we see a lot of that happening as well, as far as the why part of doing this. If you do enter into that process, and you have here in Burnsville, it's important to obviously protect local resources in that endeavor, and not just to be good stewards of the resource, which is the most important thing, but also to be able to be transparent with the community at large, right? There are constituents that everybody answers to. If they can't understand why you've approved $1 million for a given project, it's going to be problematic, right? It's going to be very difficult to try and explain that away, and you need to be able to do that. And so, you know, we generally advocate for a very open book process with anybody that's requesting assistance from you, and that involves them sharing their numbers with you all to explain exactly why they need the assistance. It involves an analysis of those numbers to make sure that what they're showing you is accurate. And then it ensures that any assistance that's provided is sized only to the extent that it's necessary to get the project feasible and no more, right? So that's a process that we kind of call our pro forma analysis. It comes out then with an explanation of why the project needs what it needs, and it's documented in writing to say, you know, this is what it is, and this is why it's not going forward. That's just helpful in terms of making sure you're right sizing assistance, but also again for that communication with constituents. We want to make sure whatever projects that's out there is going to qualify for, the assistance that you have available. We talk about pay-as-you-go assistance. That's kind of the default format. And all that means is that instead of giving a business money up front, what you're doing is, for example, if you're going to create a tax increment financing district, which we'll talk about, you're going to give them the increment that comes in over time, and they can use that to monetize and get their project done rather than the city having to pay for that up front. And so it's just protecting the city's finances that way as well. Through that process, it's just simply trying to maximize what private funding is out there and minimize what public assistance is needed for a project to be financially feasible. Does that make sense? We'll talk about how that worked in the Burnsville example here. So a lot of times that process is, you'll hear the word but-for test, or the term but-for test thrown around. There's actually, what that really means is that the project would not be possible but for the assistance that the city is providing. Okay, so that's a standard that you have to meet in state statute if you're going to use tax increment financing. It's written right into the statute. You need to make a finding and include that in your approving resolution for any TIF deal and explain why the project wouldn't happen otherwise unless you had given it the assistance. So there are different ways to do that, but that pro forma analysis is really probably the best one. And then we sort of think that, and your policy even, includes this notion that while it's not statutorily required to meet the but-for test, if you use tax abatement or some other city funding source, it's best practice to do so. And your policy actually says that you're going to do that, regardless of the source of funds. Again, as I said, it's just a finding that you have to make when you do a TIF deal, but you're not necessarily making that finding if you're using other sources of funding officially, but you're doing it on the back end in terms of the process to grant assistance. All right, some of the tools that you have available to you. I know many of you probably know what these are. This is just a very, it's not an all-encompassing list, but it's probably accounts for 95% of the funding that would happen for a city EDA for an economic development project in Minnesota. So the circled ones there are the ones that you've really accessed most. You have the ability, the city does, to have an EDA levy. So you can levy a tax that is set aside for economic development activities specifically, and use those dollars pretty freely to do about anything you want for economic development. Now, it's nice because they're flexible dollars, but it is a tax. It's a part of the city's tax rate. It gets attached to that, and the residents pay that. Residents and businesses pay that. It's not a huge impact typically on like a median value home, and even if you maximize what's allowed by statute, but it is a raising of a tax. Then there are local revolving loan funds. You capitalize those with EDA levy money or other money that you might get from a grant. Tax increment financing, which we'll talk about, is something that the city has leveraged and accessed. Tax abatement, kind of like tax increment, but just a little bit different rules. And then there are a lot of state, local, and county resources that are out there, all of which are in the project example that we're going to talk about. But it's just good to know that that those agencies all have dollars specifically dedicated for economic development, redevelopment type purposes. We'll spend just a brief amount of time talking about tax increment financing. We literally do like 2 hours of a presentation about this at our annual seminar. I'm going to just condense that down to like 5 minutes. But it's just important to understand the concept is all that really matters here. So what is it? It's when we talk about tax increment financing, we're talking about you have the ability to capture and use most of the increased local property taxes from new development that might happen out there within a defined geographic area that you set for a defined period of time without the approval of other taxing jurisdictions. So that's the important part. So when a project gets built and there are new taxes generated as a result of that, if it's in a TIF district, what would normally go to the city, county, school, and small taxing jurisdictions is segregated and sent to the city to be able to provide that to a project under a separate agreement. So that's just essentially the verbal way that is. If you're more of a visual person, this is what it looks like. All right. So you have in the blue there, starting in this case, this was an example from 2016, a project that that paid a certain amount of tax. The blue represents the current value in taxes paid by that parcel. Those when a TIF district gets created, don't go anywhere. They pay the same that they always did: city, county, school, small taxing jurisdictions. But what does happen is that when you create a district and a project starts, the area in red there is that new value that I talked about. That's new value, new tax capacity. And so over time, as that builds out, that new tax base is captured, and those new taxes are captured in the district. And just mechanically what happens is that the county segregates that. If you've created a district, they send it to the city, and then the city puts it into a TIF fund, and then they are responsible through an agreement to, if there is an agreement that's been made, to pay that out under that agreement. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. But the idea is that, and I think this, again, the example that we have at the end is really the textbook case of this. The idea is that what you do is that you build this up, and then for a short period of time, you're redirecting those new taxes that wouldn't have been there had you not done the project, right? And then when you're done, the idea is that at the end there, you have that area in orange, that bar in orange, all that new tax base is available to the city, and you've grown your tax base. Now you've had to, in the meantime, redirect some of that to the business to help offset some of those costs that we talk about. But the idea is that had you not done that, all you would ever have at the end of the day is the area in blue, right? That's that but-for test, right? The project would not have happened but for you creating the district and directing the money to the project. So the goal always in these is to get out of them as quickly as possible, get that new tax base, available to the city, and grow the tax base, really going back to that why do economic development. Does that make sense?
You don't have to give all the money back to the business, though, that might
Correct.
generate just whatever is agreed to.
That's exactly right. What happens when you create a district, they exist for varying periods of time depending on the type of district that you have, but you're going to collect all of the increment. It doesn't mean that they get all of the increment. What happens, that gets governed through a separate agreement, and that agreement is the foundation for that agreement starts with that pro forma analysis that I talked about. They may come in asking for $2 million, and that analysis might say, no, you need $1 million. And that's what you get. You get they would get the $1 million. And if the district generates two, what happens typically is it shuts down early, and that increment is never collected. It just goes back to the general tax rolls is what happens mechanically. Makes sense. And I know this is kind of important, so if there's questions about it or you're confused, and trust me, there are no dumb questions because this is really complicated. So does that make sense though, as a basic? Okay. All right, so again, you're capturing that at the end. You've got the dollars there. That's really what we're after. So that you can't just create a district anywhere in the city. You need to have the statute prescribes certain types of districts, and in order to create each of those types of districts, you need to meet certain conditions. What we see most typically for redevelopment of property are there are two types: a redevelopment district and a renewal and renovation district. The redevelopment has a 26-year maximum term, but there's a higher standard to creating that district. You have to have more buildings in the district that are substandard. And in recognition of that being a harder redevelopment to undertake, you've got a longer term to work with. You can do a renewal and renovation district, and you can have fewer buildings that are substandard as defined in statute, but you're gonna get less time. And the idea there is that you don't have as challenging of a redevelopment site, and so therefore shouldn't need as many years to get it done. So those are the two there, and again, that's really just an analysis of how many substandard buildings, how much of the site is covered, and then if it meets the statutory requirements, you can create one of those districts. And when you do that, then any kind of new development can go into those districts. The other one here is a housing district, and that's really just for affordable housing. So you can build both rental housing and for sale, owner-occupied housing. They have different requirements for affordability, but they're indexed essentially to what the low-income housing tax credit requirements are. So at least 20% of the units in this district need to be affordable to those at 50% of area median income, or you can have 40% of the units affordable to those at 60% of area median income. And as long as you meet one of those tests, then you can create a housing TIF district. For sale product, it's higher. It's 100 or 115% of median, and then 95% of the housing units have to meet that requirement in the district. For that simple job-based and tax-based creation, we have economic development district to work with. That's a 9-year district, and that's shorter term because typically those are created on greenfield property. So you're not dealing with redevelopment challenges. You're really just trying to, attract a new user to the site, maybe pay for some infrastructure costs, but you're not dealing with really costly, expensive redevelopment cleanup costs. So you've got a 9-year maximum term on that. The one that's not listed here is a soils district, which is kind of what we have in that special legislation for the example that I'm going to talk about, but that allows you to create a district to do cleanup, pollution cleanup, that you might have through a Minnesota Pollution Control Agency response action plan. So they require you to enroll into it and create a plan, and if you have one of those, you can create a district and pay for those costs out of the TIF district. Does that make sense? So just know you need to you can't just create it anywhere, you gotta have a reason to do it. Tax abatement, a little bit different. It's the same idea, except that you can actually abate all of the property's value, not even the base, if you'd like to. Now, we don't recommend that, but the statute allows it. The difference here is that all jurisdictions have to approve an abatement that participate, right? So you don't just get to automatically have the county school participation. They have to actively choose to participate. You can abate just the city's portion. They don't have to participate. But usually this is accessed when you can't find, a project doesn't fit within the box of a TIF requirement, for example. So, if you don't have a redevelopment district and you want to build market rate housing or commercial property uses, for example, those aren't allowed. And you could do anything in a redevelopment district, but if you don't have that, you want to build, we've done abatements because cities have wanted to do market rate rental housing to kind of alter the housing stock and have, more higher valued rental property. Doesn't fit in a housing TIF district because it's not income qualified, so they've used abatement. Or cities that have decided they want to help a commercial property, like a retail user on some site. Well, you can't really use TIF for that unless it's in a redevelopment district, and so they've chosen to use abatement. So we kind of talk about it as being used when a TIF district can't be used as an alternative. It's not as powerful if all the jurisdictions are participating, and the maximum term is 20 years instead of 26. So in both of these cases, abatement or increment, and you think back to that chart that I showed you, what you end up with is an annual stream of revenue, right? So maybe it's over 26 years. Maybe you have, $200,000 a year for 26 years. What good does that do a project today? And so in order to get that benefit into the project today, you need to have a financing mechanism to do that. And that's where that pay-as-you-go option that I talk about comes in. So what happens typically in these projects, and this is what the example that I have includes, is that a developer that's asking you for this assistance will go out and raise its own funds, typically through a loan or an increase to its first mortgage, to cover those additional project costs that they have as a gap. Okay, so they'll go get a loan for X amount of dollars. They'll get an agreement from the city that says the city will pay them out from the new district up to the amount of that loan that they have taken out. And once that's repaid, then the city's done. We call that's the pay-as-you-go model, right? Developer financing. City only pays from the TIF district on that pay-as-you-go note. There's an actual note that's issued to the developer. And if for some reason the project fails or the revenues aren't sufficient to repay all of the note or anything like that, the city isn't responsible to make up any other payments to the developer. It's their risk. You're only obligated to pay to the extent that the project creates the increment, and that's it. So you can see why that's appealing and less risky for the city. The other way this is done and is still done for good reason, but was done very commonly years and years ago, was the city can actually issue bonds, right? The city could actually issue general obligation debt and rely on the increment from the project to repay those bonds. Now, if you do that for a developer and there's a default, these are typically general obligation debt, and the increment isn't there, then you're gonna have to, find other resources to repay that bond, right? Probably raise taxes. So that isn't as preferred of a method. Now, there are instances where, this is still done, and, it's just done in a very careful manner, right? It might be done to help as part of an overall financing. We're working in one community that is having to build out, $20 million of infrastructure in a new industrial area. Part of the strategy for funding that is to leverage some increment from projects that are being built to pay debt service on a bond rather than using the city's levy to do it. So it's kind of a replacement for a levy and leveraging the development to help pay for some of that. So it's a little different. It's not going to a developer, it's paying for public infrastructure. And that's, if it's used anymore, is more commonly how it's done. So does that make sense? Because if we have increment over 20 years, we need money today. And so this is why we need one of these options to do it. Okay, so an example, and then I'll stop. So you probably all are familiar with that Capstone industrial project. This was, again, I would call it a very textbook case for the use of TIF. I know it's been sitting there for a very long time, nothing really happening. Pretty large site, just over 16 acres. There was a proposal, now going back, it's probably been 4 years ago. Well, it was pre-COVID since we sat in here and talked about this, but to build 231,000 square feet of industrial space in 2 buildings. And, they, right out of the gate, they said, look, we think we could do this, but there are $3.5 million of extraordinary costs on this site. And that's the reason why nothing had been happening on this site. The cost came in 2 kind of buckets. One was contamination, so, very straightforward. The other dealt more with structurally unsuitable soils. And the city had already gotten a TIF district that was created by special legislation that allowed the city to set the district up and then pay for costs of remedying the structurally substandard soils. So there was some special legislation to be able to do that. That happens a lot. There are special legislation requests every year related to TIF. But in this case, there was a $27 million project cost and those $3.5 million of extraordinary costs. And so, the developer came in, provided an application, the city looked at it, kind of looked at it in the context of the city's plans and policies like we talked about, which were out there, and said, yes, it fits. So, in advance then to that stage of looking at the developer's pro forma, going through that analysis, the kind of that but-for test. And so that process was, very detailed, looking at what are you paying for the land, what are your construction costs, are the market rents you're projecting here high enough? Because if you're showing lower than market rents, you're overstating what you really need for assistance. So there was a lot of work done to substantiate those rental projections, which, was also difficult because these were being built on spec. There weren't tenants there to, actually look at leases and things like that. That their financing is, commensurate with what the market would demand at the time. So is your debt to equity amount correct? Are the terms, both rate and amortization for the loan, appropriate? Or is their developer fee that they're charging reasonable, or is it outside of market? And is the rate of return, ultimately this all works back to what's the developer's return on investment? And is that overstated? And so in this case, this is what that looked like. So on the right is just a snippet of the project sources and uses. So how is it being paid for on the sources side, and on the bottom on the uses, what are the costs that we're having to fund? And so on the top, you can see there, well, let's start at the bottom on the right there. We've circled the $3.5 million. Those are all those extraordinary costs that we have to try to pay for. And in this case, the district, if we ran it out to its maximum term, because it was already an active district and was running out of time, only got us to $1,760,000. And so that's not 3.5 million, as everybody can tell. So there was really a need to go out there and start leveraging those other grants from those other agencies in order to get up to that 3.5 million. And so this credit to the staff that went out there, and I mean, if you look at that list there on the sources side, there's 4 different grants in this project, all of which they were successful in obtaining, which helped get up to that $3.5 million to fund that differential. And so when we went through the analysis, we looked at it and said, okay, well, if we look at the developer's project and what is their return on investment without the TIF, we found that was going to be about 5.3%. And so we were looking, there are a couple different metrics that we look at. In this case, it was yield on cost, which is simply the project's net operating income divided by its total development costs. And at the time, developers of industrial property wanted to see that number be 6.5%, closer to 7 and a little more than 7 today. So what that told us was that without the TIF, the developer wasn't hitting a yield that was going to be what the market would demand in order to provide financing for the project. So the project meets the but-for test. So then it was looking at, okay, well, we've got these grants, and then from there, it's sizing how much TIF do we need to provide to get up to a yield that's going to be acceptable to allow the project to move forward. Well, now in this case, we were limited by what we could even do because of the number of years remaining. So providing the full amount of what was left got that yield on cost up to about 6.3%, not quite to that 6.5%, but with all the grants and what the city had done with the TIF, the developer was comfortable enough that they were willing to move forward at that 6.3% level. So in this case, the targets were met with respect to the policy and the plan and the goals that the city has. It stood up to the scrutiny of that but-for test, and the size of the assistance that the city provided made sure that it wasn't giving any more than was necessary to provide a market return to get the project done. And so armed with that commitment, the developer was able to go out, get financing, put the project under construction, and I'm not sure what state it's in today, actually. I know it's probably still in varying degrees of construction. Maybe it's occupied, maybe I don't even.
So, and maybe a couple points of clarification, if I might add. So I think the slide that we have is a little bit old as far as the grants that we ended up receiving.
Well, it
and then,
probably is,
so we ended up receiving more of a environmental legacy fund grant through the Dakota County. And so we actually, that TIF number, we actually brought that down. So there was less impact to the city.
Yep.
It was a lot of work with Jason involved, the developer, Beth, myself, a huge team that worked together to make this happen. So the buildings are actually completed, open for occupancy. They've leased out one of the sites to Acme Tools. And then I'm not sure the status of the other one as far as leasing, maybe Beth, you know, but they look great. The landscaping's in, the parking's done. It's really cool to see how everything fit together, and we made, the project happen. And it, compliments to the city council, the EDC, everyone involved. It was pretty cool to see happen.
Yeah, as I say, it was a pretty textbook example of how this should go and what the outcome was. And so we use it as a case study all the time, just to point to, exactly, how a city should operate, staff, council, EDC, all the various players. If I recall, even too, one of the things that were identified through that planning process was just that, not only did all of that go the way that it should, but that there was a lack of what I'd call modern industrial space, right? In Burnsville, there were a lot of lower clear height buildings, and so they were getting passed over by a lot of businesses because they're demanding higher and higher and higher clear heights these days. This was an opportunity to not only, do a good job with the policies and everything else, but also check one of the boxes for one of the goals for the city as well. So it fit in that way as well. So that's it. That's all I have for slides. But again, I'm certainly happy to talk in more detail about this. If you want to know more about TIF, I can certainly talk more about that, or abatement. But I thought I'd give you all the opportunity to have discussion, I guess. So.
You said something about a longer discussion that you have coming up that will explain TIF in more detail. Do you have the details on what that is or who it's for?
Sure. Yeah. So as a company, every year we put on a public finance seminar, and so it's the first Thursday, Friday in February every year. So and it'll be closer, I think, to your neck of the woods here this year. But everybody's welcome. We try to gear it towards not just staff, but also policymakers, both elected and appointed officials. And so if you're interested in more of the kind of nitty-gritty details about all this, we generally have a TIF 101 and a TIF 201 session where we go a little deeper into all the details about tax increment financing. And then we generally have a whole economic development track that goes along with that. So a lot of development case study stuff, market type data, and then another track that focuses on general public finance, bonds, and that kind of stuff. So that's available and out there. I think we still also, and I'm happy to share links with the staff, but during COVID and even a little after COVID, we put a lot of that stuff online. So I think there are even like YouTube videos that you could watch if you really, really couldn't sleep at night. Those are available to you out there. But I can send links to that if that's of any interest to you all, but that's available too.
Will you send links to that?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I'd be happy to. Yeah, so those are just some of the ways, yeah.
So how much grant money is available, not just to Burnsville, but in general in Minnesota? Is it a big part of what's development, or is it a small part?
I would say that the tax increment financing is definitely the biggest part of all the deals that get done. And I think it's this particular example is a little unusual, or is more like half and half, actually more grant than TIF is the way it ended up, the way it sounded. For projects where there's contamination, there's more available. So the state, county, Met Council have pots of money to fund cleanup. So that's a lot of the grant money that's out there that's available. Housing, there's a lot of money for housing as well, but primarily affordable housing. So that's, totally separate. I can't quantify what it is. A lot of that's done through tax credits, and so that's hard to really quantify. But the pools of dollars that are out there are in the millions. Each year, there are rounds of funding, either once or twice a year, and the pools are in the millions of dollars. And they're, usually, as long as they're funded each year by those various agencies, they're generally annual recurring sources of revenue that you can count on for these projects. And then you've got the county. The county's got different funding than other counties do. Like the ELF money's different here than it is in some other counties, and that's, generally a couple $1 million, I feel like. I don't know what the...
Yeah, so that ELF, the ELF money was a pilot project that's all appropriated, but the county has a redevelopment incentive grant program where they have up to $250,000. They've made some changes, so maybe I'm have those numbers a little bit wrong, but they have a pot of money that's accessible to Dakota County cities for projects and then also for planning. So that planning dollar amount, it used to be $15,000. I think it might have been recently adjusted. And then they also have an environmental grant to do like phase 1s, phase 2s, and some, I think, money towards if you needed to complete a response action plan. So some of that more environmental work again. But yeah, DEED has a program, contamination and cleanup, and a redevelopment grant program. Metropolitan Council, through their Livable Communities demonstration account, has funding for transit-oriented development type projects, which we have 2 transit stations where development around it would be eligible. And then also their TBRA account and some other just redevelopment or development type grants. They're all competitive, each one of those. So depending on the project and what the project's bringing, it goes through a review committee and ranking, and there's a limit to the funding available. So depending on which program that is, sometimes they set aside Minneapolis and St. Paul can only capture a portion of that. Or Greater Minnesota can capture a portion of it, and so we also have a unique funding source. The dollar amount, Beth, maybe Beth, you want to talk about the host grant that we have access to as well, that we use towards
We do, so.
infrastructure projects. Sorry,
Yes,
go ahead.
no, that's okay. So since Burnsville is a host community for a landfill, we have access to a separate pot of money that other communities don't have access to. Through DEED, and so that's a really great option that we've been successful in obtaining the past few years, and so that's available as a tool as well. So the majority of the grants that Regina mentioned, as well as the host grant, the city is the applicant in partnership with the developer, and certainly that would be something that would need to be supported by City Council and reviewed for its compliance within, our vision and city code and all of those things. So, but the city does act as applicant for that.
Is there a time period on these grants, or when you have a project, do you just apply because the grant money is out there and then there's 120 days and, whatever, something like that? Or is it a period during the year when you have to put the grant in?
It depends on the grant and the funding entity. So there are some that are available to apply for just at varying points during the fiscal year. And then certain grants do have very specific deadlines. So it depends.
Any other questions for Jason? Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, no, thank you, I appreciate it, and I'll send those links.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Okay, so we will move to item 4 with Beth Weber, Economic Development Specialist, who's going to update us on the Economic Development Strategic Plan.
All right. Thank you for being here, Commissioners. We'll keep things rolling tonight with our strategic plan update. So as Jason mentioned, this is part of our Economic Development Strategic Plan, and while we are in the process of working towards updating that, these still do remain as our current goals. So ensuring the sustainability of the Burnsville Shopping Center and County Road 42 corridor, grading has begun at Jamba Juice and Auntie Annie's, which is over by the Caribou Coffee Hut on Newton and County Road 42 by the new fire station. And then City Council recently approved a PUD amendment to allow an indoor petting zoo called Sustainable Safari to be located within the Burnsville Mall. And then also under review right now for Burnsville Marketplace on Aldrich is an amendment to update their signage. So I have some graphics of each of those. The signage is notable because it's gonna provide better wayfinding throughout the site and just have more directional signage for consumers to be able to navigate. Continuing our relationship with the school district and the city, The city chamber and school district, as well as local manufacturing businesses, are still in our planning for Manufacturing Month. So look for more information on that to come out in the coming weeks. And then city staff was pleased to attend the 2023 Be Informed series, District 191 Back to School event that was hosted at Diamond Head. And the event was a partnership between the school district and the chamber, and they highlighted the chamber's business education network and School District 191's Pathways program. Continuing development within heart of the city. The Concord Place office condos are demolished, so you'll probably see some dirt piles as I have pictured there. That's a project that's being developed by MWF in conjunction with their other 2 apartment buildings, which are adjacent to that site. So construction is done for the 162 unit market rate building, and it's probably within a couple of days that construction will be done at the 135 unit senior building. Enhancing and building awareness around the city's existing housing and commercial programs. We do still partner with the Center for Energy and Environment, and to date 4 rebates have been given to Burnsville residents and 10 visits have been completed. Just an update on our homework program, the senior deferred loan and the home improvement loan. The funds are currently exhausted, but we would continually monitor that and would update our website as those loans get repaid. And then we do still have funds available within our Code Cash program for folks that have property maintenance issues with our Neighborhood Services Department, where the city pays 50% and then the homeowner would pay the other half to bring whatever that issue is into compliance. Open to Business is still a great resource for our residents and businesses here in Burnsville. They provide confidential business advisor counseling, and 9 businesses have been served, as well as 7 residents as of the second quarter of this year. And we do still also partner with the Burnsville Chamber on Grow Minnesota visits. 16 have been completed, and we have 24 that are contracted through the end of the year. And then finally, continuing the city's position as a regional destination. Some of you might have heard about our placemaking initiative within Heart of the City. So we have 12 Jersey barriers that are kept in Heart of the City and used for all of the various community events that happen in Nicollet Commons Park. And we are looking to have those be painted, perhaps something similar to the example on that slide, to be more engaging with the community. So that RFP, excuse me, is posted on our website right now, and we are hopeful that we have lots of great options to choose from. We had ribbon cuttings at Boot Barn and Beltone of Burnsville. And then we do still have lots of fun events for fall. We have Yappy Hour, the Fire Station Open House, and then the Run Now Gobble Later 5K. And I think that concludes my strategic plan updates, if there are any questions on that. No? All right. Well then, the next item for me is just some updates. So I encourage you all to continue checking out our development map. Our staff keeps it very up to date, and you can learn all about the great projects that our Planning Commission and City Council have approved. Our next meeting is November 8th. And then certainly, whether it's on our training tonight or anything else related to economic development, certainly reach out to us with questions. And then if there's nothing beyond that, I do have a couple, oh, go ahead.
The property down on South Cross, any progress on that?
The city-owned parcel on South Cross in Portland.
Yep.
We do still have it actively marketed for sale, but we don't have any offers at this point.
Did you go to the second stage of the environmental review, or it's just first?
We have not completed a phase 2.
Maybe you need a bigger sign.
I think our signs are good. All right, well then I just have 2 final items to mention tonight. We would like to recognize Al Anderson. for his service on the Economic Development Commission, as tonight is his last meeting. He has been selected to serve on our Planning Commission, and I'm sure that he'll continue to show the same passion for Burnsville there that you've shown here. So thank you for serving
Thanks.
tonight.
Thank you.
And then finally, it is with heavy hearts that we extend our condolences for the recent passing of Anthony Strangis to his family, friends, and community. His service to the Burnsville community during his 13 years as a resident of Burnsville, and even longer as a 51-year resident of Dakota County, is truly appreciated, particularly for his role recently on our Economic Development Commission. He will be missed.
All right, thanks, Beth. This time, I'd like to request a motion for adjournment of the September 13th, 2023 Economic Development Commission meeting.
So moved.
Second.
Great, all in favor of adjourning?
Aye.
Aye. Great. Then the motion is carried, and we can adjourn. Thanks, everybody.